Great Galveston Hurricane of 1900. The Great Galveston Hurricane of 1900, a historical catastrophe. Introduction. The Great Galveston Hurricane of 1900 stands as one of the most catastrophic natural disasters in American history. Known as the deadliest hurricane ever to strike the United States, the storm's impact on Galveston, Texas, and its surrounding areas was nothing short of devastating. This video delves into the intricacies of the hurricane, exploring its meteorological development, the lack of preparedness, the hurricane's immediate and long-term effects on the city of Galveston, and the significant changes it brought to disaster management, urban planning, and meteorology. This video will present a comprehensive exploration of the hurricane's devastation, tracing the city's recovery and ongoing relevance in disaster preparedness and response. Through the lens of historical analysis, the Galveston Hurricane serves as a case study for understanding the intersection of nature, human vulnerability, and resilience in the face of catastrophic events. Setting the stage, Galveston before the hurricane. Before the hurricane hit in September 1900, Galveston was a booming city in Texas. It was the largest city in the state and one of the most important ports in the southern United States. Often referred to as the Wall Street of the South, Galveston was a bustling center of commerce and wealth, with a population of approximately 37,000 people. Situated on a barrier island along the Gulf of Mexico, Galveston enjoyed a favorable climate and geographical position that contributed to its success as a trading post. The city's thriving economy was driven by its key industries, including shipping, cotton exports, and finance. Galveston's position along the Gulf Coast made it an ideal gateway for good traveling between the United States, Mexico, Central America, and other ports of the world. The port's prominence contributed to Galveston's reputation as a cosmopolitan and wealthy city. Its architecture, buildings, and social institutions reflected this prosperity, with the cities boasting advanced infrastructure for its time, such as electric streetcars and telephone service. Yet Galveston's geographic location also made it particularly vulnerable to hurricanes and tropical storms. The island sat only a few feet above sea level, and despite several smaller storms affecting the area in previous decades, there was no significant infrastructure in place to protect the city from a major hurricane. The local population was generally unaware of the magnitude of the threat posed by tropical cyclones, and many believed that the city's position made it relatively safe from direct impacts. Moreover, the city lacked a seawall or other forms of coastal protection. As Galveston thrived, it seemed poised to become one of the most influential cities in the southern United States. However, the lack of understanding about the hurricane's risk, combined with the city's exposed location, would soon lead to one of the greatest tragedies in American history. The meteorological origins of the Great Galveston Hurricane can be traced to late August 1900, when a tropical depression formed in the eastern Atlantic Ocean. As it moved westward, the system gradually intensified, eventually becoming a tropical storm. By the time the storm reached the Caribbean Sea in early September, it had developed into a hurricane. The storm's movement was consistent with the general westward track that many Atlantic hurricanes followed during the hurricane season. In 1900, meteorological forecasting was still in its infancy, and communication systems were primitive by modern standards. The United States Weather Bureau, responsible for issuing weather warnings, had limited capacity to accurately predict the path and intensity of the hurricane. Weather stations relied on surface observations from ships in coastal locations, and the dissemination of weather information was often delayed due to the lack of rapid communication methods. The concept of satellite monitoring, radar, and advanced computer models was still far in the future. On September 1, 1900, the tropical storm that would become the Great Galveston Hurricane is first detected in the tropical Atlantic. The storm was initially tracked by ships at sea, which reported strong winds and rough seas as it headed westward towards the Caribbean. The storm was observed near Cuba, and meteorologists in Havana and the United States Weather Bureau recognized that it was likely to affect the Gulf of Mexico. However, there was considerable uncertainty about whether the storm would make landfall. The Weather Bureau's chief, Isaac Klein, who was stationed in Galveston, had expressed skepticism about the likelihood of a catastrophic hurricane hitting the city, based on prevailing scientific theories at the time. Isaac Monroe Klein was a pivotal figure in the tragic story of the 1900 Galveston Hurricane. In March 1889, a Texas section of the Weather Bureau was being established, and Klein was sent to Galveston to organize and oversee it. Klein stayed with the office when it became part of the U.S. Weather Bureau in 1891. In 1892, Isaac's younger brother, Joseph Klein, also began work as a meteorologist at the Galveston Weather Bureau. During his time in Galveston, aside from running the weather office, Klein also taught Sunday school at the church, was a professor of local medical college, and in 1896 earned a Doctor of Philosophy degree from Anne Rand Male and Female College, now Texas Christian University. As a meteorologist for the U.S. Weather Bureau, the precursor to today's National Weather Service, Klein played a significant role in both the events leading up to and during the storm. Though his involvements has been subject to both historical reflection and criticism, he was stationed in New Orleans and later in Galveston, Texas, where he became the chief meteorologist. Klein was regarded as highly capable and knowledgeable, a prominent figure in early American meteorology. His role in Galveston placed him in the heart of one of the most dangerous regions for hurricanes on the Gulf Coast. His own wife, Cora, was among the thousands who perished. Professionally, Klein was both praised for his warnings and criticized for his earlier confidence that a disaster of this scale could not happen. Some believe that had he begun his warning earlier and more forcefully, more people could have been saved. However, others argue that with the limited knowledge and technology of the time, there was little anyone could do to prepare for such an unprecedented storm. In the aftermath of the hurricane, the Weather Bureau relocated to New Orleans, Louisiana. Isaac Klein and his brother Joseph moved with it. There, he developed a stellar reputation over the years, successfully forecasting significant levels of flooding in 1912, 1915, and 1927. In 1927, he published a book named The Tropical Cyclones, a collection of his research. He was also the chief meteorologist in New Orleans during the Great Mississippi Flood of 1927. In 1934, by that time well respected and highly admired in New Orleans, Klein received an honorary doctorate from Tulane University. Klein retired from the Weather Bureau in 1935, remained in New Orleans, and indulged in his lifelong interest in art, both by painting and by opening an art shop. He published multiple books about art. Klein died in 1955 at the age of 93. His brother Joseph Klein discussed the storm and its aftermath in his autobiography, When the Heavens Frown, published in 1946. September 6, 1900. The storm begins to gain strength as it crosses the warm waters of the Gulf of Mexico. By this time, meteorologists in the United States had limited understanding of the storm's trajectory, but warnings were sent to Galveston about a potential weather event. However, the seriousness of the threat was downplayed by some local officials, and the Weather Bureau's ability to predict landfall accurately was limited. On September 7th, the storm began to approach Texas coastline. Despite warnings from other parts of the country, including Cuba, the Galveston authorities and much of the population were largely unaware of the scale of the impending disaster. The local Weather Bureau office in Galveston issued a hurricane warning, but it was too late to fully prepare the city for what was about to unfold. The storm intensifies into a major hurricane, likely of Category 4, though exact measurements were not possible at the time. Some reports of rough seas and strong winds began to reach Galveston, but most residents remained largely unaware of the impending disaster. On the morning of September 8th, the day started with ominous signs in Galveston: rising tides, crashing waves, and darkening skies. By noon, the sea is rising rapidly, flooding parts of the city. Despite this, many residents did not evacuate. They believed Galveston was immune to hurricanes due to its slightly elevated position above sea level. In the afternoon of September 8th, as the hurricane approached the island, it becomes apparent that the storm will be far more destructive than initially thought. By mid-afternoon, the storm surge, estimated to have reached 15 feet, begins to inundate the city, washing away homes and buildings. Winds intensified to 145 miles per hour, destroying structures and sending debris flying. Many people sought refuge in sturdy buildings, but few buildings were able to withstand the force of the storm. One such building was the St. Mary's Orphanage. The tragic story of the St. Mary's Orphanage during the 1900 Galveston hurricane is one of the most poignant and heartbreaking chapters of this disaster. St. Mary's was a Catholic orphanage operated by the Sisters of Charity and was located near the Gulf of Mexico on Galveston Island. When the hurricane struck September 8, 1900, the orphanage was directly in its path, leading to one of the most devastating losses of life in the storm. The orphanage before the storm was home to around 93 children at the time of the hurricane, most of them boys, though there were some girls in the care of the sisters. The orphanage consisted of two wooden buildings situated near the beach. The Sisters of Charity, a religious order dedicated to helping the poor and caring for the sick, ran the orphanage with a spirit of service and love. 10 nuns lived at the orphanage, caring for the children and providing them with safe and nurturing environment. On the day of the hurricane, as the winds intensified and the water began to rise, the sisters moved the children to the second floor of the orphanage building for safety. Despite the worsening conditions, there was hope the storm would pass without causing catastrophic damage. However, by the afternoon, the situation had become dire. The storm surge began to flood the area, and the winds grew even more violent. Realizing the gravity of the situation, the sisters did what they could to protect the children. In a heroic and heart-wrenching effort, the nuns tied the children to themselves using clothesline, hoping that if the buildings were destroyed, they would be able to keep the children with them in the raging waters. As the hurricane reached its peak, the storm surge engulfed the orphanage, and the wooden structures could not withstand the tremendous force of the water. The buildings were destroyed, swept away by the waves, and the children and nuns were carried into the floodwaters. Despite their efforts to stay together, the raging waters claimed the lives of nearly everyone. Of the 93 children and 10 nuns, only 3 boys survived. These 3 managed to cling to a tree until the storm subsided. The bodies of many children and nuns were found in the days following the storm, still tied together by the clotheslines, and a tragic testament to the sisters' attempt to protect the children. The nuns' bravery and devotion became legendary, and their actions have been remembered as a symbol of selfless love in the face of overwhelming tragedy. In the wake of the disaster, the loss of the orphanage resonated deeply with both local community and the Catholic Church. The surviving boys who witnessed the deaths of their friends and caregivers carried the memory of the event for the rest of their lives. In the years that followed, St. Mary's Orphanage was rebuilt, though in a different location, further inland to avoid the threat of future storms. A memorial was also erected to honor the nuns and children who perished in the hurricane. Their stories has become an enduring part of the Galveston history. Remember for their courage of the Sisters of Charity who, in the face of unspeakable danger, did everything they could to protect the lives of the children in their care. The Galveston Orphanage Home was the recipient of immense charity after the hurricane. William Randolph Hearst, the famous newspaper publisher, sponsored a charity bazaar at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York City on October 15th and 16th, 1900, to benefit the home. The crowd raised $50,000, and prominent guests included Samuel Clemens, better known as Mark Twain, Miss John Astor, and the Texas Governor Joseph D. Sayers. This fund was enough to rebuild the Galveston Orphanage Home. Evening of September 8th. The storm reaches its peak intensity as the eye passes over Galveston. Most of the city is submerged, and the storm surge has flattened large portions of the island. Survivors describe terrifying scenes of waves crashing over rooftops and buildings, collapsing under the pressure of wind and water. Thousands of people are swept away by the floodwaters. Isaac Klein and his family barely survived by clinging to the debris. The human toll was staggering. Estimates of the death toll vary, but it is widely believed that between 6,000 and 12,000 people perished in the hurricane, making it the deadliest natural disaster in U.S. history. Many victims were swept away by the storm surge or trapped under collapsed buildings. In some cases, entire families were killed as their homes were torn apart or submerged by the rising waters. Survivors of the hurricane describe scenes of unimaginable devastation. The storm hit with such sudden force that many residents were caught off guard and had no time to seek adequate shelter. Some climbed on top of roofs to escape the rising waters, only to be swept away by the surge. Others sought refuge in public buildings or with neighbors, but even those structures were often no match for the power of the storm. The aftermath of the hurricane. In the immediate aftermath of the hurricane, the city of Galveston was plunged into chaos. The storm had cut off communication with the outside world, and it took several days for the full extent of the disaster to become known. When relief workers and rescuers finally arrived, they were met with a scene of utter devastation. Bodies lay strewn throughout the streets and in the wreckage of buildings, and the city's infrastructure had been completely destroyed. In the days following the hurricane, the residents and survivors of Galveston was left to deal with the overwhelming task of recovery. With thousands of bodies decomposing in the heat, the city was faced with an urgent public health crisis. There was no organized system for burying the dead, and initially, many bodies were buried at sea. However, when the bodies began washing back ashore, the decision was made to bury the dead in large funeral pyres. The city's remaining residents were left without homes, clean water, or food. The loss of life and destruction of the property made it difficult to carry out even the most basic recovery efforts. The U.S. Army arrived to assist in the recovery, and volunteers from across the country also came to help with rebuilding efforts. However, the sheer scale of the destruction made it difficult to provide immediate relief to those affected by the hurricane. Galveston's rebuilding effort. In the wake of the disaster, the city of Galveston faced the daunting task of rebuilding. The hurricane not only destroyed homes and businesses, but it also decimated the city's infrastructure. Rebuilding Galveston required both immediate relief efforts to provide shelter and basic necessities for the survivors, as well as long term planning to ensure the city would not be vulnerable to future hurricanes. One of the first priorities was to protect the city from future storm surges. In response to the devastation caused by the hurricane, city officials and engineers embarked on an ambitious project to construct a seawall along the Gulf Coast to protect Galveston from future storms. The construction of the Galveston seawall began in 1902, and it would eventually extend over 10 miles in length. The seawall was designed to provide a barrier against storm surges, raising the city's defense significantly. In addition to the seawall, city leaders undertook another monumental project, raising the elevation of the entire city. Because much of the Galveston was only a few feet above sea level, engineers determined that the city would need to be raised to reduce the risk of flooding from future hurricanes. Over the course of several years, homes, buildings, and streets were raised by as much as 17 feet. This unprecedented engineering feat was carried out by using sand and dredged materials to fill the areas around the city. Despite these efforts, Galveston would never fully regain its former status as a prominent port city in Texas. The destruction caused by the hurricane, combined with the rise of Houston as a commercial and shipping hub, contributed to the decline of Galveston's economic importance. Nonetheless, the city's rebuilding efforts represented a remarkable display of resilience in the face of tragedy. Lessons learned in advancement in meteorology. The Great Galveston Hurricane had a profound impact on the field of meteorology and the development of hurricane forecasting. At the time of the hurricane, meteorological science was still in its early stages, and the ability to predict the path and intensity of hurricanes was extremely limited. The lack of accurate forecasting played a major role in the devastation of Galveston, as the city's residents were unprepared for the severity of the storm. In the aftermath of the hurricane, there was a growing recognition of the need for improved weather forecasting and early warning systems. The U.S. Weather Bureau, which had been criticized for its failure to adequately warn the public about the hurricane, began to take steps to improve the forecasting capabilities. Over the following decade, advancements in meteorology, including the development of radar and satellite technology, would dramatically improve the ability to track and predict hurricanes. The Galveston hurricane also underscored the importance of public awareness and preparedness in reducing the impact of natural disasters. In the years following the storm, efforts were made to educate the public about dangers of hurricanes and the importance of taking appropriate precautions. This emphasis on preparedness would later become a key component of disaster management and response efforts in the United States. The culture and social impacts of the hurricane. The Galveston hurricane left an indelible mark on the city's culture and social fabric. The hurricane not only destroyed physical structures, but also disrupted the lives and livelihoods of the city's residents. In the years following the disaster, Galveston's population declined as many residents chose to relocate to other parts of Texas, particularly Houston, which was an emerging major economic center. The hurricane also had a profound psychological impact on the survivors and the city as a whole. Many of those who lived through the storm were left with traumatic memories of the destruction and loss of life. The disaster became a defining moment in Galveston history, shaping the city's identity and its sense of resilience in the face of adversity. In the broader context of American history, the Galveston hurricane contributed to a growing awareness of the need for federal and state governments to play a more active role in disaster response and recovery efforts. While the U.S. Army and other organizations provided assistance in the aftermath of the hurricane, there was no comprehensive national system for disaster management at the time. The legacy of the Great Galveston Hurricane. More than a century after the Great Galveston Hurricane, the disaster's legacy continues to shape the city and the nation. The construction of the seawall and the raising of the city have helped protect Galveston from subsequent hurricanes, though the city remains vulnerable to powerful storms. Hurricane Ike, which struck Galveston in 2008, was a reminder that the threat of hurricanes is ever present, and it underscores the importance of ongoing preparedness efforts. Nationally, the hurricane served as a catalyst for improvement in meteorology, disaster preparedness, and urban planning. The lessons learned from the Galveston disaster has been applied to subsequent hurricanes and other natural disasters, helping to save lives and reduce damage. Today, advanced forecasting techniques, early warning systems, and public education efforts are all part of the nation's strategy for minimizing the impact of hurricanes and other extreme weather events. Conclusion: the Great Galveston Hurricane of 1900 remains a defining moment in American history. Its unprecedented destruction, combined with enormous loss of life, serves as a stark reminder of the power of nature and the vulnerability of human communities. Yet the story of Galveston is also one of resilience and determination in the face of overwhelming adversity. The city's effort to rebuild and protect itself from future storms stands as a testament to the human spirit's capacity to recover and adapt. The legacy of the Great Galveston Hurricane extends far beyond the city itself. It influenced the development of modern meteorology, disaster management, and urban planning, and its lessons continue to inform how we respond to natural disasters today. As we face new challenges posed by increasing frequently extreme weather events, the Storm of Galveston serves as both a cautionary tale and an inspiration for how we can build more resilient and prepared communities.